Chapter 26. Nock loved the smell of her firefighting gym. It was the scent of lemon blossoms, fresh scrubbed floorboards, and the sweat of hard work. She'd put plenty of her own hard work into her last training session, and the blisters on her palms where she gripped her staff were proof. Nock blew on the tender skin as she walked out of the studio and down the hall toward her room. "Hey, good fight tonight," called a voice behind her. It was Dee. She was a nice girl, a year older than Nock, but 2 levels below her in training. "If you keep that up, you'll beat Bull again next year for sure." "Thanks." "Hey, it's just us here, so you can tell me." Dee leaned a little closer. "What's your secret to being so good, huh?" "My secret?" "Oh, come on. You're better than some of our teachers. You must know something the rest of us don't." Nock blinked, not sure how to answer. She'd kept to herself for so long that it was hard to remember how to make conversation with someone her own age. She had never had many friends before. Most other kids were either jealous of her or found her perfectionism annoying. Nock wrapped her arms around herself and shrugged. "If you just keep practicing, you'll get there, I'm sure." "All right, fine. Be that way," said Dee, sticking out her tongue playfully. "Do you want to walk home over the bridge with me?" Dee's family also lived on the west side, but thankfully they almost never crossed paths with Nock's parents. Part of Nock longed to say yes. She imagined strolling with Dee back home, maybe even stopping at an ice cream cart along the way. She pictured them talking and laughing, making plans for sleepovers. The vision was fleeting. Nock shook her head. "Can't, sorry," she said. "I'm staying overnight the whole week. Our house is getting painted, so my mom thought it would be good timing for me to get in extra practice." "Gosh, no wonder you beat the pants off the rest of us," said Dee, laughing. "If I lived at the gym too, maybe I'd be as good as you." Nock twisted the hem of her tunic as she watched Dee walk away, taking their imaginary future friendship out the door with her. She let out a breath and shook her shoulders. She didn't have time to think about silly things like ice cream and girlfriends. She needed to get going. Nock was indeed sleeping at the gym. By her calculations, she had a little over 1 week to track down Pong, if he was still alive. Her parents would go back to Tanaburi to visit during the upcoming holidays, and she'd have to be there. In the meantime, she had some money, but not enough to pay for a guest house room for a week. Her gym was on the east side, in what used to be a good part of town, near the bridge that connected the east and west banks. There were simple sleeping quarters at the top of the building, where students traveling from other towns could stay during competitions. The only downside of staying at the gym was that she needed to spend at least half of each day training to make it look convincing that she was there for a reason and not just to have a place to crash while she hunted down the runaway monk. In her room, Nock changed from her sweaty uniform into a fresh one. She took out her notebook and unfolded the map of the east side that she'd bought the day before. She'd suspected that it would be hard to find Pong in Chitana, but it wasn't until she got to the city that she realized how difficult her challenge was. Chitana was like a pile of pebbles. If you stepped on it, it would shift and change until the surface was the bottom and the bottom was the top. She'd already spent several fruitless days searching, but she wouldn't give up. Not yet. She would stick to her plan of moving through the city methodically, neighborhood by neighborhood, scoping out the streets and canals. Pong couldn't stay hidden forever. As an orphan and a runaway, he wouldn't know anyone who would take him in and feed him. He'd have to surface sometime to get food, or he'd starve. Nock folded up her map and stuck it under her mattress. Leaving her staff behind, she stepped out of the room and slid her bedroom door shut behind her. Out in the city, Nock wound her way from the quiet neighborhood of the gym into the gritty heart of downtown. Mobs of children ran down the gangways on bare feet, squealing as they launched off the sidewalks and dove into the river. And on a school night, they'd be useless in class the next day. Nock suddenly realized she couldn't recall seeing a school on the east side before. But that was silly. There had to be schools here. How else would the children learn to read or write? These were the neighborhoods she'd been warned about by her parents, the places good girls from the West Side didn't dare set foot in. It was thrilling and a little scary to be there alone, but even without her staff, she didn't worry about taking care of herself. Dee had guessed right. She did have a spirefighting secret. It wasn't that she didn't want to share it with Dee. Well, maybe that was partly true. But mainly she didn't want to talk about it because she couldn't figure out how to explain it without sounding weird. A year ago, Nock had traveled with her father on a work trip across Chaitana's northern border to the town of Lanaburi. The journey was long, and her father's meetings were unbearably boring, but the last meeting of the trip took place in a library. Chaitana had few books left from the days before the Great Fire, so Nock devoured the titles, reading as much and as quickly as she could before they had to leave. The last book she found was about the history of spirefighting. According to the crumbling book, it was an old art form that had begun back when Chaitana was little more than a sleepy fishing village. It started as a self-defense practice used by the wise men and women who lived on the neighboring mountaintops. The name spire probably referred to the bamboo walking sticks the old sages carried with them. According to that book, the principles of spire fighting stated that everyone has a light deep inside them. The book said it was like an ember or a tiny piece of glowing coal. Just as an ember can start a raging fire if it's fed the right fuel, a person can fan the flame inside them and use it to do all sorts of extraordinary things, like knock a loudmouth named Bull flat on his back, for example. Nock's teachers had never mentioned anything about this during her lessons. Perhaps that part of the sport had been long forgotten. But as soon as Nock read it, something clicked. Spirefighting wasn't about strength or how well she memorized the moves. It was about finding that hidden light inside herself and letting it pour out. From that moment forward, she had been able to fight better than anyone else her age. Even her teachers said she was becoming as good as the old masters. But she could never explain what she had learned to anyone, not even her teachers. Just thinking about it, all that talk of flames and fire felt sort of illegal. Nock shook her head and forced herself to focus on her route. She had absent-mindedly let the crowd carry her along like a current, and they had pulled her away from the main canal onto a narrow street. The air formed hazy rings around the blue orbs that hung between shops. Nock avoided eye contact with the other people around her as she tried to retrace her steps. She turned down one alley, then another, but the streets grew dim instead of brighter. The blue orbs gave way to violet. It was so dark that Nock stumbled and put her foot into a deep puddle of mucky water. At least she hoped it was water. She was lost. People passed this way and that through the purple shadows, but Nock didn't dare ask for directions. Stay calm, she told herself. Just keep walking, and you'll find your way out eventually. But then, up ahead, on a narrow wooden bridge, she spotted the shine of a bare scalp. All her anxiety about being lost vanished, and her heart hopped in her chest. Could it really be him? Using the nothing step, she stalked closer, then closer. She regretted leaving her staff behind now, but she wouldn't let that stop her. She would drag him back with her bare hands if she had to. He stood with his back to her, leaning over the rail of the bridge. Nock silently threaded the gap between the crowd and lunged at him. She grabbed him with both hands. "In the name of the governor, you're under arrest." The boy spun around. He wasn't a boy at all. He was an old man, thin with hunger. His sunken eyes searched her face. "Can you spare anything, miss?" he asked hoarsely. "Any change? I haven't eaten today." Nock dropped her grip on him and lurched back, nearly tripping over a mass of blankets and bones. Another person. "Please, miss." A woman coughed, holding up her hand. Her other arm cradled a baby. "Do you have any money? Anything at all?" More outstretched fingers reached for Nock. She spun around. The bridge was full of people, the elderly and sick, men and women in rags, leaning on canes. Tiny children curled around their legs with dark, weary eyes that caught Nock's own and tore at her heart. Please, please, miss. Anything? Anything at all?" They reached for her the way a drowning man reaches up at a passing boat. Knock backed up, but more people gathered behind her, blocking her way. She wanted to say something, but couldn't get out the words. Knock tore herself away from them and ran. She ran on, not caring which way she went. She just wanted to get away. She ran down one alley, up another, and another, until she came to a dead end. A monstrous building blocked her way, its top half scorched black. Fish-flavored steam billowed out the open door on the first floor. Knock bolted into the shadows and collapsed against the wall of the blackened building. She slid down to her knees and covered her face with her sleeve. She couldn't get those voices out of her head. "Please, please, miss." Knock's pocket jangled with the money she'd brought to buy herself dinner. She could have given it to them. She imagined going back and turning her pockets inside out, even though she knew there wasn't enough money in them to go around. She squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head. Of course there was suffering in the world. Everyone knew that. But Knock had never seen it so close before. It had knocked the wind out of her, and she was a girl who rarely got the wind knocked out of her. Light shines on the worthy. Usually when the governor's words popped into her head, they gave her strength, but tonight they did nothing to banish the sad things she'd seen. They were words that belonged in a sunny classroom, as useless here on the east side as her mother's fancy dresses. Knock might have sat there all night, unable to gather herself and find her way home, but she was pulled out of her thoughts by a trio of people who seemed to be walking straight toward her. She shrank against the wall, willing herself to melt into the shadows. At the last minute, they turned sharply and went around the back of the building. Knock watched them go. What a strange group they made. A broad-shouldered man with a neck like an ox, a small man with a broken nose and a scuttling swagger, and a woman wearing a man's jacket who tossed a tangerine peel over her shoulder. It tumbled across the ground and landed at Knock's feet. Once they were gone, Knock reached out and picked up the peel. She put her nose to the rind and breathed in. It smelled sharp and bright, like sunlight and clean water, and something else that Knock couldn't name. She clung to the rind and inhaled again and again.